What would you do if in the dead of a Wyoming winter, a scarred rancher found a half-naked woman marked with ashes by her own tribe and left to die in the snow? Would he risk his solitude to save her or let the cold claim another soul? The wind has a way of scouring a man down to the bone out here, and not just from the cold. It strips away the unnecessary parts of you, the soft words and easy comforts, until all that's left is what's needed to survive. For 7 years, that's all I had been. A man stripped down, living with the ghosts of a life that had burned down to embers. My name is Elias Thorne, and this land, this unforgiving stretch of Wyoming territory, was my self-imposed exile. It was the heart of a brutal winter in 2083, the kind that freezes the marrow and makes you wonder if the sun will ever remember the way back. The snow had been falling for weeks, a relentless silent siege that buried the world in a shroud of white. My life had shrunk to the size of my cabin, the barn, and the line of traps I ran through the silent, snow-choked pines. It was a small world, but it was mine, and its quiet was a balm on a soul that had heard too much screaming. I wasn't looking for anyone. God knows the last thing I wanted was another soul to be responsible for. The one I'd sworn to protect was lying under a simple wooden cross behind the barn, a victim of a winter much like this one. Annalise. Her name was a ghost on my lips, a memory that tasted of ash. That morning the cold was a physical thing, a presence that bit at any exposed skin. I was out checking a section of fence near the southern ridge where the wind piled the snow into monstrous drifts. A pine heavy with ice had cracked and fallen, taking a length of my fence with it. 2 of my cattle, driven by a dumb, desperate hunger, had pushed through the gap. Their tracks were faint, already being erased by the steady fall of new snow, leading down into the shadowed maw of what we called the Ghost Creek Ravine. It was a treacherous place, a tangle of rock and deadfall, and I figured I'd be tracking them until dusk. I expected to find them frozen or worse, already found by the wolves whose howls were a nightly prayer in this valley. What I didn't expect to find was her. My horse, Old Job, saw her first. He stopped dead ears, twitching, his breath pluming in the frigid air. I followed his gaze, my eyes scanning the landscape of white and shadow. At first I thought she was a deer brought down by the pack. A heap of something dark and still against the pristine snow curled at the base of a skeletal aspen. But the shape was wrong. Too small, too human. A cold that had nothing to do with the temperature snaked its way up my spine. I swung down from the saddle, my rifle in hand, more from instinct than any conscious thought. Every step I took was a muffled crunch in the deep powder, the silence of the ravine pressing in on me. As I got closer, the details began to resolve themselves, and they made less and less sense. It was a woman. She was lying on her side, half buried in a drift, wearing next to nothing. A tattered piece of dawskin was knotted at her hips, a pathetic shield against a cold that could kill a bundled man in hours. Her skin was a canvas of angry red and deathly blue, a testament to the frost's cruel artistry. But it was the ash that stopped my heart. It wasn't dirt. It was thick and black, deliberately smeared in broad, damning strokes across her shoulders, her chest, and one side of her face. It was ritualistic, a marking. I'd seen it once years before the war among the Ute, a mark of shunning, of casting out. It was a sentence of death meant to be carried out by the indifferent cruelty of the wilderness. They had marked her with the ashes of her own life, and left her for the cold to claim. Her hair, a long tangled mat of black, was threaded with ice crystals. Her body was curled in on itself, a desperate, futile attempt to preserve some core of warmth. I saw the shallow, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her ribs. She was alive. Barely. For a long moment I just stood there, the rifle heavy in my hands. The wind whispered through the bare aspen branches, a mournful, lonely sound. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back. This was not my fight. I had come here to be alone, to let my own wounds scar over in peace. Bringing her back to my cabin would be inviting a world of trouble I wasn't equipped to handle. She was tribal, and her people, whoever they were, had done this for a reason. Interfering was a fool's errand. Leave her, the voice of self-preservation whispered. It's the way of things out here. You can't save everyone. But then I saw her face, what I could see of it beneath the grime and the terrible ash. High cheekbones, a strong jaw. Even in this state there was a fierce pride etched into her features. And I thought of Annalise, how her own face had looked in the end, pale and still. I thought of how I had sat by her bed helpless as the life faded from her. I couldn't save my own wife. The thought was a spur sharp and painful. I couldn't save Annalise. But this woman, she wasn't dead yet. With a curse that was lost to the wind, I knelt beside her. I didn't touch her, not yet. I just looked, taking in the full measure of the cruelty. The doeskin top she must have been wearing was ripped away, leaving her almost entirely exposed. The ash was caked between her collarbones, a dark stain against her frozen skin. Punishment. Humiliation. This wasn't just exile. It was a desecration. I didn't hesitate any longer. Shrugging off my heavy sheepskin coat, I laid it over her. Then I unbuttoned my thick flannel shirt, the icy air a shock against my own skin. I didn't care. I gently draped the shirt over her, tucking it around her shoulders and down over her chest, trying to cover her as much as possible. My fingers brushed her arm. It was like touching stone. Her eyelids fluttered. Just a flicker. A spark of life in the vast, cold emptiness. She didn't speak, didn't move, but for a second her dark eyes met mine. There was no fear in them. There was nothing. Just a deep, profound emptiness, as if she had already accepted her fate. That was enough. All right now, I murmured the words, feeling clumsy and loud in the silence. Let's get you out of here. I hooked my arms under her knees and back. She was terrifyingly light, a bundle of bones and frozen flesh. Her head lolled against my shoulder. The faint heat coming off her wasn't life. It was the dry, dangerous heat of a raging fever. Getting her back to old Job was a struggle. The snow was deep, and carrying her threw me off balance. Each step was a plunge into the freezing powder. By the time I reached the horse, my lungs were burning and sweat was freezing on my brow. Job shied away, his eyes wide with the scent of sickness, and something else. Something wild. Easy, boy, I grunted, calming him with a hand on his neck. I managed to get her draped over the saddle, then hauled myself up behind her. It was an awkward, miserable ride back. I held her tight against my chest, trying to shield her from the wind with my own body, feeling the unnatural heat of her fever even through my undershirt. She didn't make a sound. She was a dead weight, a silent passenger on a journey she hadn't asked for. The 3 miles back to my cabin felt like 100. The world was a blur of white snow and gray sky. The only sounds were the plodding of Job's hooves and the ceaseless moan of the wind. And in my head another sound, the echo of a promise I had made to myself 7 years ago. No one else. Never again. As the low silhouette of my cabin appeared through the swirling snow, a grim thought settled in my gut. I wasn't just bringing a half-dead woman back from the brink. I was bringing the world back into my carefully constructed solitude. And I had a terrible feeling that the quiet I had worked so hard to find was about to be shattered for good. The cabin door groaned in protest as I kicked it open, a gust of wind and snow chasing me inside. The single room was cold and dark, the fire in the hearth having died down to a bed of sullen, glowing embers. It was a sparse place built for function, not comfort. A stone hearth dominated one wall, a sturdy table and 2 chairs, one of which hadn't been used in 7 years, sat in the center. My cot was pushed against the far wall, and shelves holding Tin's tools and a few tattered books lined the space above it. It was a lonely man's home, and the sudden presence of another person especially, one in such a desperate state, felt like a violation. I carried her straight to the cot and laid her down as gently as I could. The mattress was stuffed with straw, but the wool blankets were thick. She sank into them, a fragile indentation in my solitary life. Her breathing was a shallow, rattling sound that scared me more than any wolf's howl. First things first. Fire. I moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who lives alone. I stirred the embers, adding kindling, and then larger logs until a hungry flame leaped up the chimney, casting flickering shadows across the room. The warmth began to push back the oppressive cold. Next, water. The barrel outside was frozen solid, so I grabbed a bucket, filled it with clean snow from the porch, and set it near the fire to melt. She was burning up. I could feel the heat radiating from her. I found a clean rag, dipped it in the now tepid water, and sat on the edge of the cot. As I touched the cool cloth to her forehead, her whole body flinched. A low, guttural sound escaped her lips, a sound of pure instinctual fear. She was trapped in some nightmare I couldn't see. Easy now, I said softly, my voice rough from disuse. You're safe. You're safe here. I wasn't sure if I was talking to her or to myself. I did my best to clean the ash and grime from her face. Her skin was stretched, taut over her bones, her lips cracked and blistered. The dark, deliberate smudges of the ash seemed to have seeped into her very pores, a stain of shame that water couldn't easily wash away. I didn't try to remove the rags she wore. They were barely there, and she was covered now. But I saw the ugly purple bruises on her arms and ribs. This was more than shunning. There had been violence. Someone had held her down and marked her, beaten her, and then left her to die. Why? The question hammered at me. What had she done to earn such a fate? Refused a marriage, broken a sacred law. It didn't matter. Whatever the reason, the judgment had been absolute. As night fell, the world outside disappeared into a black, howling void. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, rattling the single window pane. I set a pot of beans and salted pork on the hearth to simmer the smell, filling the small space. I couldn't bring myself to sit in the unused chair. It was still Annalise's chair. Instead, I stood by the fire, sipping coffee from a tin mug, my gaze constantly drawn to the still figure on my cot. She was a stranger, an Apache girl, I was fairly certain from her features, in a world of trouble. But she was also just a girl no older than 20, I reckoned. Too young to be so acquainted with death. The memories I had buried under years of solitude began to stir. I remembered sitting in this very room in this same helpless vigil as Annalise's fever raged. I remembered the feel of a cool cloth on her skin, the sound of her labored breathing, the way the firelight danced on her pale face. The parallels were a knife in my gut. I had failed then. The thought of failing again was unbearable. I knew I wouldn't be sleeping in the cot. Not with her in it. I grabbed my spare wool blanket, laid it on the floorboards near the hearth, and used my coat as a pillow. I lay down fully clothed, my rifle propped against the wall next to me. Not because I feared her, but because the world that had cast her out might come looking. Sleep wouldn't come. I listened to the storm outside and the storm inside. Every time she moaned or shifted in her fevered sleep, I was instantly alert. Her dreams were violent. Once near midnight, she cried out a sharp, terrified sound that clawed its way out of her throat. Her arms thrashed, her hands clenched into fists, fighting some unseen enemy. I went to her, kneeling by the cot. "Shh," I whispered, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "It's just a dream. You're safe." She didn't wake, but the sound of my voice seemed to soothe her. The thrashing subsided, and she sank back into a restless sleep. I stayed there for a long time, watching the firelight play over her bruised face, feeling the profound weight of her life in my hands. This was exactly what I had run from. The intimacy of another person's pain, the responsibility. By dawn, the fever hadn't broken. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world of stunning, silent white. The sun rose, casting a pale, watery light across the snow-covered valley. The world looked clean, reborn. But inside the cabin, the fight for life continued. I spent the day in a grim routine. I tended the fire, melted more snow, forced a few sips of broth between her cracked lips. I went out to the barn to feed old Job and the 2 remaining cattle, the cold air, a welcome shock to my senses. The silence and the mundane work were a relief from the tense quiet of the cabin. When I came back inside, I'd sit by the fire cleaning my rifle or mending a piece of harness, my ears always tuned to the sound of her breathing. It was on the second day that she woke. I had been dozing in the chair, the one I'd finally forced myself to use. A small sound, a rustle of blankets, jerked me awake. My hand went to the knife on my belt before I was fully conscious. She was sitting up, the blankets clutched to her chest. Her eyes, wide and dark and terrified, were fixed on me. They were the eyes of a cornered animal ready to fight or flee. She was weak, her body trembling, but there was a fire in that gaze that hadn't been there before. The emptiness was gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. I held up my hands slowly, showing they were empty. "Easy," I said, my voice low and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't speak. She just watched me, every muscle in her body tensed. Her gaze darted around the small cabin, taking in the door, the window, the rifle against the wall. She was assessing her prison, looking for a way out. I stood up slowly, deliberately. I walked to the hearth, picked up a tin cup, and filled it with water from the bucket. I placed it on the small crate I used as a bedside table, well within her reach, but not so close that I had to crowd her. "Water," I said, pointing to the cup. Then I backed away, giving her space, and sat back down in the chair across the room. We stayed like that for what felt like an hour. A silent, tense standoff. She huddled on the cot, a wild thing brought in from the cold. Me sitting in my dead wife's chair, a stranger who had stolen her from her fate. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of my own heart. Finally, with a shaky, deliberate movement, she reached for the cup. Her hands trembled so badly she had to use both of them to bring it to her lips. She drank in short, desperate gulps, her eyes never leaving me. When she was done, she set the cup down and sank back against the wall, exhausted by the effort. She didn't thank me. She didn't speak, but she had accepted the water. It was a start. A fragile, uncertain truce in the heart of the winter. I didn't know her name or her story or what the hell I was going to do with her. All I knew was that the silence in my cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the breathing of another person and the terrifying, unwelcome return of hope. The days that followed were a slow, quiet dance of caution and necessity. A blizzard descended upon us, a howling white fury that lasted for 3 days and nights, sealing us in completely. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the cabin, the fire, and the two of us trapped in a bubble of tense silence. The snow piled up against the door, and the wind screamed like a banshee, a constant reminder of the fate I had snatched her from. During that time, she never left the cot. She'd watch me with those wide, dark eyes as I moved about the room, my shadow stretching and shrinking in the firelight. I kept to a routine, a predictable rhythm I hoped would soothe her fear. I'd rise, stoke the fire, make coffee, and then head out to the attached lean-to to chop wood. I'd come back and stamp the snow from my boots, and set about my chores, mending tack-sharpening knives, cleaning my rifle. Every action was slow, deliberate, announced. I didn't want her to ever feel surprised or cornered. She ate what I gave her, broth, a little hardtack softened in water, but only when I set it down and walked away. She was like a wild fox I was trying to tame, taking the offering only when the threat of my presence was removed. Her fever broke on the second night of the blizzard. I woke to a different kind of quiet. The rattling in her breath was gone, replaced by a steadier, deeper rhythm. I went to her and placed a hand on her forehead. The skin was cool, damp with sweat. The crisis had passed. She was still terribly weak, her body little more than a skeleton draped in skin, but she was going to live. The relief that washed over me was so profound it left me dizzy. When she woke later that morning, there was a new clarity in her eyes. The fever-fueled fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, assessing intelligence. She took in her surroundings not as a prison but as a place. She looked at the shelves, the tools, the single faded calico curtain on the window. She was piecing together the story of the man who had brought her here. I was sitting at the table patching a tear in my coat when she spoke for the first time. Her voice was a dry, raspy whisper, as if the words themselves were brittle from disuse. "Where?" I looked up, startled. I set down my needle and thread. "My cabin," I said. "Wyoming territory. You're about 20 miles north of the Sweetwater River." She absorbed this, her gaze turning to the window where the snow swirled in a thick, impenetrable curtain. She was lost, and the blizzard was a stark illustration of just how lost she was. "Why?" The single word held a universe of questions. "Why did you save me? What do you want from me?" I thought for a long moment, choosing my words carefully. "I was tracking lost cattle. I found you in the ravine. You were freezing to death." I paused, then added the only truth that mattered. "I couldn't just leave you there." She didn't respond. She just watched me, her expression unreadable. I couldn't tell if she believed me or if she was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. In her world, a man like me, a white man, didn't help a person like her without a reason, and rarely was the reason a good one. The blizzard finally broke on the 4th day. The silence it left behind was absolute, profound. The world was buried under a fresh 4 feet of snow, the sunlight on it so bright it hurt the eyes. I had to dig my way out of the cabin. As I shoveled, I felt her presence behind me, watching from the doorway, a silent observer wrapped in one of my blankets. That afternoon, she got out of the cot for the first time. She moved stiffly, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. She walked to the hearth and stood there, soaking in the warmth, her back to me. It was the first time she had willingly turned her back on me, and the small act of trust felt monumental. She was still wearing the flannel shirt I had given her. It hung on her thin frame like a shroud, the sleeves rolled up a dozen times. She saw me looking, and her hands went to the collar, pulling it tighter, a gesture of self-consciousness, of shame. I looked away, giving her privacy. Later, while I was outside clearing a path to the barn, I saw her through the window. She had found the bucket of water and a rag and was carefully, methodically washing. She washed her face, her arms, her legs. She was reclaiming herself, scrubbing away the ash and the grime, trying to become whole again. The next day, a quiet shift occurred. I came in from feeding the livestock, cold and tired, to find the hearth swept clean. A small, neat pile of kindling sat beside it. She was sitting on the floor by the fire, her back against the warm stones, and in her hands was one of my other flannel shirts, one that was worn and torn beyond repair. She had unraveled some thread from a burlap sack and was using a small awl from my leatherworking kit as a needle. She was sewing. I stopped in the doorway, watching her. Her fingers were clumsy and slow, but her focus was intense. She was fashioning something for herself, a garment that was hers, not a cast-off from a stranger. I didn't say anything. I just hung up my coat, poured myself a cup of coffee, and sat at the table. We worked in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire, the whisper of her needle through the cloth, and the scrape of my knife as I carved a new handle for my axe. It was in that quiet moment that she spoke her name. "Lena." It was so soft I almost didn't hear it. I looked up. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were still on her work, but she had offered a piece of herself, a gift. "Elias," I said in return. She glanced up then, just for a second, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Lena. Elias. We were no longer just a man and a woman, a rescuer and a victim. We had names. That evening she ate at the table for the first time. She sat in Annalise's chair, but it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. She was still quiet, reserved, but the fear was gone. She had fashioned a crude tunic from the old shirt, and while it was shapeless and poorly stitched, she wore it with a quiet dignity. She was no longer wearing my clothes. She was wearing her own. As we ate the simple meal of beans and jerky, I noticed her eyes kept straying to the shelf above my cot. On it, next to a tin of tobacco, was a small cloth-wrapped parcel. It was Annalise's. Her sewing kit, a few letters from her sister, and a pressed wildflower from the summer before she died. Lena's curiosity was plain, but she didn't ask. She was learning to read the silences just as I was. That night, something felt different. The cabin didn't feel so empty. As I lay on my blanket by the fire, I could hear the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing from the cot. It was a sound of life, of resilience. I found myself thinking not of what I had lost, but of what I had found in the snow. A flicker of warmth had begun to grow in the cold, empty space of my heart. It was a terrifying feeling. It felt a lot like hope, and I had long since decided that hope was a luxury I couldn't afford. But as the fire died down to embers, I lay awake and listened to her breathe, and for the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel entirely alone in the dark. The weeks crawled by, measured not by a calendar, but by the slow melting of the snow, and the even slower thawing of the woman I now knew as Lena. The winter held its grip on the valley, but inside the small cabin, a fragile spring was taking root. The silence between us was no longer heavy with fear and uncertainty. It had become a language of its own, a comfortable space built of shared chores and mutual respect. Lena had a quiet strength that amazed me. She began to take on more of the household duties, never waiting to be asked. She'd rise with me at dawn, her movements deft and silent as she stoked the fire or put coffee on to boil. She had a knack for order, and my cluttered, functional cabin began to feel more like a home. She refolded my blankets, organized the tins on the shelves, and even scrubbed the floorboards with a stiff brush until they shone. One morning I walked in from the barn, a bucket of milk from my one remaining cow in hand, and stopped dead. She was standing by the window, humming a soft, tuneless melody. She had restitched the tunic she'd made, fashioning it into a proper dress that fit her now recovering form. She had washed her hair, and it hung down her back in a thick, shining black braid. She had woven a thin strip of red cloth torn from an old bandana of mine into the end of it. She turned and saw me watching, and for the first time a real smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. My breath caught in my throat. "Good morning, Elias," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Morning, Lena," I managed to reply, setting the bucket down with a thud. That same day she followed me out to the tool shed. I was repairing a broken stall door, struggling to hold a heavy plank in place while I hammered. Without a word, she stepped forward and took the weight of the board, her small hands surprisingly strong. Her shoulder brushed against mine, a casual, unremarkable touch that sent a jolt through me. We worked together, our movements falling into an easy rhythm until the job was done. I didn't thank her. It felt unnecessary, as if we had moved beyond such formalities. Instead, I handed her my skinning knife and gestured toward a pile of deer hides I had yet to cure. I'd seen her looking at them. I knew her people were masters of this craft. She took the knife, her eyes meeting mine with a look of understanding, and set to work. Hours passed. I sat on a nearby stump, oiling my tack, while she worked the hides with a skill that was both beautiful and efficient. The late afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the snow. It was peaceful. I hadn't felt peace like this in years. That evening, as we sat at the table, a comfortable quiet settled between us. She reached for the salt, and the loose neckline of her dress slipped, revealing the graceful curve of her collarbone and the top of her shoulder. My eyes flickered to the exposed skin, and I felt a sudden sharp pang of desire. It was so unexpected, so unwelcome, that I froze a piece of jerky halfway to my mouth. She noticed. Her hand stilled, and she looked at me, her dark eyes searching my face. I didn't look away. I held her gaze, letting her see the conflict in my own. I was ashamed of the thought, ashamed of betraying Annalise's memory. But I was also just a man, and a lonely one at that. After a long moment, Lena simply pulled her dress back into place and continued her meal. She didn't look angry or frightened. She just looked understanding. The next evening, she chose to sit beside me on the small bench on the porch. The air was crisp and cold, our breath misting in front of us. She wore my heavy sheepskin coat, the sleeves rolled up. Her leg brushed against mine, and this time neither of us moved away. We sat in silence, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet sky. The loneliness I had carried for so long felt lighter. After a while, she shifted and rested her head against my shoulder. It was a simple, trusting gesture, but it felt as intimate as a kiss. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stayed perfectly still, afraid to breathe, afraid to break the spell. "Elias," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, why did you really help me?" It was the question I had been dreading, the one I hadn't fully answered for myself. I thought of all the practical reasons, the excuses I had made. But in the quiet darkness, with the warmth of her beside me, only the real truth seemed to matter. I took a deep breath. My wife, Annalise, she died in this cabin. A winter fever 7 years ago. The words were rusty, painful to speak. I sat with her for a week. I held her hand. I watched her fade away. And I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. I paused, the memory a raw, open wound. When I found you were dying. And I couldn't watch it happen again. Not if there was something I could do. She was silent for a long time. I felt a tear track down my cheek, freezing almost instantly in the cold. I hadn't cried for Annalise in years. Lena shifted, lifting her head. She reached up and gently with the tips of her fingers brushed the tear from my face. "No one else did," she whispered. It wasn't an answer to my story, but a piece of her own. They all watched. No one else did anything. That was all she said. It was enough. It was everything. We were two broken people haunted by ghosts who had found a strange, unexpected solace in each other's company. She leaned her head back on my shoulder, and we sat there until the cold drove us inside. That night, as I lay on the floor, I knew something had irrevocably changed. The wall I had built around my heart had been breached. She slept in the cot and I on the floor, but the distance between us had vanished. We were no longer strangers. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized with a terrifying certainty that I was beginning to care for the woman my wife's memory had compelled me to save. The thought scared me to death. The first true thaw of spring arrived, not as a gentle warming, but as a messy, chaotic melt. The world dripped and oozed. The creek behind the barn swelled into a muddy torrent, and the oppressive silence of winter was replaced by the constant sound of running water. The land was waking up, and so it seemed were we. The unspoken tension, the awareness that had been simmering between Lena and me had grown into something undeniable. We moved around each other with a new consciousness, a new gravity, a simple brush of hands as she passed me a cup of coffee, the way her eyes would meet mine across the table. These small moments were charged with a meaning that left me feeling breathless and unsteady. She had brought life back into my home, not just with her presence, but with her touch. She had planted a small garden bed behind the cabin, turning the cold, hard soil with a persistence that mirrored her own recovery. She had found a stash of Annalise's old jars and had begun foraging for early spring roots and greens. The cabin, which had for so long smelled only of wood smoke and solitude, now carried the faint, earthy scent of sage and wild onions. One afternoon, I was in the barn mending a split fence post when she walked in. She was holding a small parcel carefully wrapped in a piece of clean hide. She knelt beside me in the hay-strewn dirt and set it down. "I made this," she said, her voice soft. I wiped my hands on my trousers and opened it. Inside lay a small figure carved from a piece of deer bone. It was a woman kneeling, her head bowed. The style was simple, but the posture conveyed a profound sense of reverence and grief. My chest tightened. "It is for your wife," she said, her gaze steady. "For her grave." I stared at the carving, my throat too thick to speak. I had never told her about Annalise, not in detail. But she had seen the wooden cross. She had seen the way my eyes would skirt past it. She had understood my grief without a single word from me. She had seen the wound and instead of ignoring it had offered a balm. I stood up, the carving clutched in my hand, and walked out to the small snow-melted patch of ground behind the barn. She followed, a silent presence at my side. I knelt by the simple cross, brushed away the dead leaves and pine needles, and placed the small bone figure at its base. Her name was Annalise, I said the name, feeling strange and holy on my tongue. Lena didn't reply. She just stood beside me, sharing the weight of the moment. We stayed there for a long time, the spring breeze cool on our faces. When we walked back to the cabin, something had been settled between us. A ghost had been acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement had been given peace. That evening, the dam of silence finally broke. We sat at the table, and for the first time we talked. Really talked. "You curse like a soldier," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. After I'd muttered something foul about a log that wouldn't split, I admitted the confession feeling like a stone lifted from my chest. Union Scout. I spent too much time on this land hunting men instead of game. She nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. I knew it, she said. You walk like a man who is always watching his back. She paused, then added, my brother was a warrior. He walked the same way. He was killed by men like you. The words hung in the air between us, stark and unadorned. There was no accusation in her voice, just a statement of fact. A chasm of history and blood opened up between us. I'm sorry, I said the words, feeling pitifully inadequate. The war. It made monsters of us all. Yes, she said quietly. It did. That night, the space between my bed on the floor and her cot felt wider than ever. But later, as the fire burned low, she got up. I watched from the shadows as she crossed the room and stood over me. Then she knelt. Her fingers, light as a moth's wing, touched the long puckered scar on my ribs, a gift from a Confederate bayonet. She traced its length, her touch sending a fire through my veins. It wasn't a gesture of pity or even curiosity. It was a gesture of recognition. I know what it is to be marked, she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. I reached up and took her hand, my calloused fingers wrapping around her delicate wrist. She didn't pull away. She leaned in, her face close to mine, her warm breath on my skin. She pressed her forehead to mine, a gesture of such profound, aching intimacy that it broke something inside me. We stayed like that for a long moment, two scarred people finding a strange comfort in the dark. Then she rose, returned to her cot, and the cabin was silent again. But I lay awake for hours, the feel of her touch burning on my skin, the wall around my heart crumbling to dust. The next evening, after a long day of work, she leaned over and kissed me. It was a simple, chaste kiss, her lips soft and warm against mine. It was hesitant, questioning, and it ended almost as soon as it began. But it was enough. When she pulled back, her eyes searched mine. You never asked, she whispered. What they did. Why they left me. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted to, I said, my voice hoarse. I don't want to talk about it, she said. But I want you to know, what they tried to take from me was not theirs to give. I understood. The shame they had tried to brand her with had not taken root. She had survived not just the cold, but the hatred. She had kept a part of herself sacred and whole. I didn't save you for that, Lena, I said, my voice fierce. I know, she whispered. I chose to stay. You never asked me to. I wouldn't have. That night, she didn't go to the cot. After the fire had dimmed, she came to me. She took my hand and led me to the bed that had been mine alone for 7 years. There were no words. There was no need for them. There was only the slow, deliberate unbuttoning of my shirt, the gentle touch of her fingers on my skin, the way her eyes never left mine. Her body was strong and real beneath my hands. I touched her with a reverence I didn't know I possessed, my hands mapping the story of her survival. When I kissed the place on her ribs where the ash had once been, a shudder ran through her. It wasn't a shudder of fear. It was a shudder of release. In the flickering firelight, we came together. It was not a desperate, frantic coupling. It was a slow, tender exploration, a quiet conversation between two bodies that had known too much pain. It was an act of reclamation, an act of defiance, an act of profound, life-affirming grace. Afterward, we lay tangled in the blankets, her head on my chest, her hand resting over my heart. I held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of her heart against mine. The ghosts in the room were silent. For the first time in a very long time, the cabin was not a place of haunting, but a place of healing. And as I drifted to sleep, I knew with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified me that I was no longer alone. The morning after felt like the first day of a new world. The light filtering through the window seemed softer, the air in the cabin warmer. I woke first, careful not to disturb Lena. She was curled against me, one arm thrown across my chest, her breathing deep and even. In sleep, her face was stripped of its guardedness, revealing a vulnerability that made my chest ache. For 7 years, I had woken up to a cold, empty space beside me. Now there was warmth. There was life. I lay there for a long time, just watching her. A storm of emotions warring inside me. There was a fierce, protective tenderness I hadn't felt since Annalisa. But there was also guilt, a sharp, stabbing feeling of betrayal. And beneath it all, a powerful, undeniable joy that was so foreign it felt like a danger. When she finally stirred, her eyes fluttered open and found mine. She didn't flinch or pull away. She didn't try to cover herself. She just looked at me, a quiet, searching gaze. Do you regret it? She asked, her voice husky with sleep. I didn't have to think. No, I said, the word coming out with more force than I intended. A slow smile spread across her face, and she nodded. as if I had confirmed something she already knew. That day we moved through our chores with a new unspoken intimacy. The space between us was no longer charged with tension but with a quiet, humming energy. While I was outside splitting wood, she came to me with 2 bundles of cloth. One was the faded blue fabric of an old army coat of mine, one I hadn't been able to bring myself to throw away. The other was a spool of thread and a piece of canvas. "I thought I would sew something for you," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "A new shirt." "All right," I said, wiping sweat from my brow. She paused, a hint of a smile on her lips. "It will not be perfect." "Don't need it to be," I replied. She handed me the shirt that evening. It was plain, the stitches a little uneven, the sleeves not quite the same length. But when I pulled it on, it fit better than any shirt I owned. As I adjusted the collar, her fingers came up to smooth the fabric at my neck. Her touch was light, proprietary. "You look like yourself," she said quietly. I wasn't sure what she meant, but looking at my reflection in the dark window pane, I saw a man I hadn't seen in years. The haunted, hollowed-out look in my eyes was gone. Maybe that's what she saw. A man who was no longer just a ghost. That night I did something I hadn't done in 7 years. I took down the small cedar box from the top shelf. Lena stopped sweeping the hearth and watched me. I opened it and took out a simple, thin copper ring. "This was Annalise's," I said, my voice thick. I placed it on the table between us. "She's gone. And I think she would want someone to wear it. Someone who brought life back to this place." I looked at her. "If you want it." Lena stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the ring. She didn't touch it. "I am not her Elias." "I know," I said. "I don't want you to be. I will not be what you had before." I met her gaze, my heart pounding. "I don't want what I had before. That life is over. I want what I have now." She stared at me for a long, silent moment. Then she reached down, picked up the ring, and slid it onto the 3rd finger of her left hand. It was a little loose, but she didn't seem to mind. She looked up at me, her jaw set with a fierce determination. "Then I stay," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. "You already have," I replied. We didn't call it a marriage. There was no preacher, no witnesses, no piece of paper to make it official. But it was a vow nonetheless, a promise made in the heart of the wilderness, witnessed only by the crackling fire and the quiet ghosts who had finally found their peace. The next morning we built a 2nd chair. We worked together, measuring the wood, sawing the planks, sanding the edges smooth. Her laughter, a sound I had never heard before, echoed in the small cabin as I fumbled with a nail. When we were done, 2 chairs sat by the fire, 2 cups on the shelf, 2 lives intertwined. Spring deepened into early summer. The world turned green and vibrant. The garden Lena had planted began to sprout, a testament to her patient care. Our life settled into a rhythm of shared work and quiet affection. We rode into the small settlement of Briar Hollow for supplies. It was the first time I had been seen with anyone in 7 years. The stares we received were long and hard. A white man and an Apache woman. It was a sight that set tongues wagging. But I walked beside her, my head held high, and met every curious or hostile gaze with a steady one of my own. She was with me. That was all that mattered. One morning a few weeks later, I was chopping wood when she came out onto the porch. There was a quiet, luminous smile on her face, a look of secret knowledge. She held something in her hands, a small bundle of cloth. "I made something," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I set down the axe and took it from her. I unfolded the cloth. It was a tiny shirt, no bigger than my 2 hands put together, sewn with the neatest stitches I had ever seen. I looked at her, my mind struggling to understand. "It is not certain," she said, her hand going to her stomach. "But I think it is." I stared at the tiny shirt, then at her. A child. Our child. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. For years this cabin had been a tomb, a place of endings. Annalise and I had tried for a child, but it had never happened. Now, here in this place of loss, a new life was beginning. I stepped forward and pulled her into my arms, burying my face in her hair. My shoulders shook with emotions I couldn't name: joy, fear, a profound, overwhelming gratitude. I placed my hand over hers on her stomach. "Then we'll raise them here," I said, my voice choked. "Together." She leaned into me, her body relaxing against mine. "Together," she repeated. That evening we sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose. The land that had once been my prison now felt like a sanctuary. It was our home. Lena took the copper ring from her finger and handed it to me. She held out her hand. "You never asked," she said softly. I took her hand in mine. It felt small but strong. I slid the ring back onto her finger, this time with a slow, deliberate purpose. "I don't need a preacher," she whispered. Just you. I looked into her eyes, the eyes of the woman who had walked out of a nightmare, and into my life, the woman who had taught me how to live again. Then you have me, I said. Always. And that was our wedding. Barefoot on our own land, with the dirt under our nails and a future growing inside her. The wind that had once scoured me down to the bone now felt like a gentle caress. Everything that had been taken from us, everything we had lost, was being rebuilt right here together. And this time I knew no storm could ever tear it down. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.